Hello, hello. Today we are going to do a very quick overview of congressional elections, just some very basic facts. Let's start with what is Congress. Congress is the legislative branch of the United States government. That means they are in charge of writing laws, and when those laws get approved by Congress, then they are sent to the president, who either signs them or vetoes them. Congress is split into two parts: the House of Representatives, which we call the lower chamber, and the Senate, which we call the upper chamber. Now, in the House of Representatives, we have representatives. That's what their title is. The number of representatives per state depends on population. So if you have a state with a lot of people in it, like California, they have 53 representatives. But Alaska, which has very, very few people in it, only has one. Now, these representatives are elected only by their congressional district. States are split up into districts that all are supposed to have roughly the same amount of people in them, and then you vote for the representative of your district. There are 435 representatives total. You'll notice that is an odd number, which means that there can never be a tie. Representatives serve 2-year terms, and then they have to run for re-election. So they have to be re-elected every 2 years. But there are no term limits, which means they can run for office over and over again. Now, a reminder, the president has to run for office every 4 years, and they have a term limit of 2. So you can only be president 2 times, and those elections happen every 4 years. So you may notice that means that the representatives have to run every 2 years. And when we have an election in the middle of a president's term, we call that a midterm. So we have these elections where there isn't a presidential election happening, but all your representatives are running for re-election. That's a midterm election. Here's an example of a congressional district map. This is Texas. It has 36 districts. All these districts have about the same number of people in them, and the people in these districts vote for just their representative. If you look at these maps, sometimes you'll see really wonky, weird looking districts. This one is also in Texas. It starts up here in Austin. It follows the highway down. There's this little curly Q shape in San Antonio. Now, sometimes there are really good reasons why a district is going to look weird or have a weird shape, and sometimes it could be an example of gerrymandering. Gerrymandering is a term you hear all the time on the news, and it is this idea where politicians in power will redraw these district maps in a way that gives them and their political party an advantage in the next election. And we generally agree it is a bad thing to do. Let's talk about the Senate. The Senate has senators. That's what we call people who are elected to the Senate. And they get only 2 per state. So both California and Alaska get exactly 2 senators. Now you might be thinking, that's 100 total. So if they vote on something, they could tie. Well, that is one of the few jobs that the vice president has, is to be a tiebreaker in the Senate. So the vice president gets to break any ties that happen. Now, senators represent their entire state, which means the entire state votes on them. This was not always the case. Senators used to be appointed by their state governors and legislatures, but that was changed to being an elected position in 1913. Their terms are longer than the representatives. They get to be in office for 6 years rather than just 2, and there are no term limits. So again, they can vote, or they can run again and again and again. However, it should be noted that even though they get to be in office for 6 years, there are senators running for re-election every 2 years, because a third of them run for re-election every time. So let me show you kind of what that looks like. It's kind of hard to imagine. Say you have Senator A, who was elected in the year 2000, Senator B, who was elected in the year 2002, and Senator C, who was elected in the year 2004. So in 2005, all of these senators are still having their terms. They're still in office. But in that 2006 election, Senator A is going to have to run for re-election. In 2008, Senator B will have to run for re-election. And in 2010, Senator C will run for re-election. So even though they get 6-year terms, someone is running for office in every election. Now, again, remember what I said about presidents running every 4 years? So in 2000, 2008, and 2004, 2000, 2004, 2008, those were presidential election years. 2002, 2006, and 2010 were midterm years. So why do we have two halves of Congress? What's even the point of having Congress be split in half like this? Well, the Senate gives equal representation to all states, regardless of population, right? All the states get an equal number of votes. Whereas the House gives equal representation to people, equal representation based on population. So all people should have the same amount of representation in the House. This was a compromise by the writers of the Constitution to balance the wishes of those 13 original colonies. If you think about it back then, the northern colonies becoming states had a lower population. So they wanted the Senate model because that would give them equal power compared to the larger southern states. The South wanted the House model because they had more people in it. And so if they had more votes based on population, then they would get more votes and have more power than the northern states did. Now, it should be noted that the reason that the South wanted this is because they were trying to count their enslaved population as part of the population for determining representatives. So states that had a lot of enslaved people on them, so you had those big plantations in the South, would have gotten more representatives. This is also the reason why the Three-Fifths Compromise exists. The Constitution, the writers agreed to do this split House and Senate model, but then they also said that in the House, enslaved people would only count 3/5 towards the population that determined how many representatives you got and also how many electors in the Electoral College you got. Obviously, the Three-Fifths Compromise is no longer in play since slavery was abolished, but it is important to sort of keep that history in mind. So let's talk about Congress today. Congress writes laws, and the president does not. So the president and the presidential election get a lot of attention in media, but in a lot of ways, Congress actually has more power over your day-to-day life because they are deciding on those laws and voting on laws. This means that midterm elections are really important. The presidential elections every 4 years get a lot of attention, but the midterm elections don't. Even though all representatives are running and a third of senators are running in these midterms, a lot fewer people show up to vote. In Congress, there are no term limits, like I've said. The president can only be president 2 times, but a senator or representative can be in office over and over and over again, sometimes for decades. And then we have this idea of incumbency advantage. An incumbent is someone who is already in office running for reelection. And we see in studies that if you are an incumbent, you are already in the office and you are running for reelection, it is much, much, much easier to get reelected than the person who's running against you. To the point where it's like 80 to 90% of the time, an incumbent will get reelected while the person trying to replace them will lose. So you have to ask yourself, are these good things or are they problems? Is lower turnout in midterm elections a problem? Why is it? Should there be term limits in Congress? Why or why not? Is the incumbency advantage a problem? And if so, how would we fix it? Or is it just fine? Those are big questions, and it's really up to you to learn about the issues and decide what you think.